start my recording. Welcome to my another session. Today we're going to talk about what goes into a drawing. It's going to be a very conceptual kind of a thing. It's not going to go into more of a Revit side of things, but I think this one should kind of cover a lot of the issues we see in a lot of the office where, you know, some junior guys came into the office. They may not understand some of the, you know, the drawing, how to put them together, and this should kind of like cover most of that. Okay, let's see. So majority of the time when you do a drawing, in the old days, what we do is that we do pen and paper. Okay, that's the older day. What ended up happening in the modern era, where we see a lot of digital version, where we see CAD, you see that to picture, one is SketchUp, where 3D becomes a very useful tool, as well as 2D as well. So we're still seeing a lot of this being used today. Okay, they haven't changed since the beginning of time. So just keep in mind that a lot of this information is just to represent something to be built. Now, often I always get asked, like, is there a standard? Like, what is the standard? However, the only problem is that it can get very complicated. I've done a lot of these standardizations in the past where I give people manual, just let them read. Unfortunately, the only problem I always have is great, but, right? The problem with standards is it's ever changing. As the software keeps evolving, the standard has to change to adapt to the new one. So every year it's kind of like, you know, different methodology, different workflow, and it becomes a very like difficult to kind of keep it maintained. Okay, I've seen like standard that was done like 5 years ago. Now it's kind of obsolete because it's no longer used. So time can change very quickly. I mean, it's almost like a yearly evolve. Like you just have to evolve your things as the software keeps updating itself. So most often, I always get asked by, you know, help desk, right? So you always ask me for a question: does it work? Does it not work? And all that stuff. Most often, this is the only way I could kind of like analyze the issue, because sometimes your question actually make me understand how the software behave, because if you create a standard, it's not always going to be helpful, because the standard kind of like you have to follow a certain rule, but the problem is that the software keeps changing. It will break one of your standard rule. So it's kind of like the only way I could see it moving forward is that guys like you guys have to kind of ask the question. So I kind of have to do this constantly, auditing, you know, make sure that everything works out, and tell other people how I would approach certain things. So when you do anything, you have to start from, you know, somewhere. Okay, so I always say, if you get into this industry, you have to start somewhere. Not everybody's going to be good at everything, so someone has to start from somewhere, and then you just basically build your skill level based on that. I always find that to be very useful. Other offices I've seen is that if you guys are really good at, let's say, a software, then you should be the one who kind of develops standard, kind of mentor other people to, like, you know, do a certain way so that you help them and foster that. That's kind of like how I would train people, is that somebody had to start somewhere, and this is how we kind of create a really, really great environment. It's not always going to be top-down approach. It's always usually the bottom-up approach. I like to do it more of a bottom-up because I want to see everybody's skill level and kind of like work around that. That's pretty much the idea. So whenever you don't learn anything, let's say, you know, you did something and it took you 3 hours. Most often, this is how I started. I had to do research, I have to do certain things. But the unfortunate thing about, well, the fortunate and unfortunate, the unfortunate thing is that majority of the time when you look up internet, they don't tell you anything. So what I do is that if you have this eagerness to kind of want to learn and want to do stuff and like, experiment, at the end, you most often I always find that you can actually get more out of that than you just say, okay, I'm just going to rely on this person or wait for Autodesk to give me answers. Because majority of the time, if you're not proactive with the software, you are not going to find solution. So a lot of time I always say, okay, I won't do it, but I would say, just do it anyways, and then at the end you find a solution. So this is kind of like the pre-plan I always love to use. Like first, what you do is that you do planning, executing, and reporting, and see how it works. So what happened is that we always plan out stuff, determine what the firm needs. First, you need like planning, like to know the templates, to know all the materials and all that stuff, and then later on, create like a focus group to just get people to kind of like executing and see, see if it's working for them. And then most often, reporting is where user has to tell me if it's working or not. Because this is where, a lot of the planning comes in play is through this kind of methodology. It always goes in circle. First we plan it, next thing is executing. Lastly, we have to do reporting because of, sometimes it doesn't work, so we have to change the methodology. So when it comes to drawing organization, this is kind of like your standard since, the 15th century. So what we have is that you have a 3D model, and what you do is that you basically take drawing and project it into floor plan elevations and section. I know that in the old days, if you ever do drawings, there's usually axonometric and isometric. I think isometric is what we use a lot in the 3D software now. Axonometric, it's another way of doing your 3D, but I think this is getting phased out. I don't see this too many in the new software, so it's always isometric. So when you doing a drawings, usually we start with the big and go to more specific. So what ended up happening is that you always have to think about how plan goes together. So it's like a storyboard. You have to tell it from like the most, like the biggest piece of puzzle down to like the most specific. So most often what happens is that the plan carries the most weight, and then the details basically supplement whatever's on the plan. So majority of the time, what I've seen is that user focus more on the plan, and then later on, once you get into the more nitty-gritty details, it's usually tends to be the last. So when you look at pen weights is very important. In the old days, what we do is that we used to have this technical pen. Okay, what ended up happening is that each of those pen costs. This is like from 2015, but it could change. Like it's like costing around like almost $50 Canadian. Okay, I think right now it could be probably more than that because so little people uses this technical pen. So what this means is that each of them has this line weight, so 0.13, 0.18, 0.25, et cetera, et cetera. So how we represent that in, let's say, Revit or AutoCAD is we go by color. Like in AutoCAD, we go by color, but in Revit, we go by line weight. So what we're supposed to do is that think of it as the old days when you draw a technical pen, you translate that pen weight into this. Okay, that's all we do typically. So this is how, like, I know that some user loves to kind of create their own line weight, which is fine. You can do that. But I always say, you know what, if you have to look up how conventional drawings are done, usually just look up like one of this websites saying that, okay, what's the pen weight available? So this is sort of the pen weight, and we just put it into the digital version. For AutoCAD, typically how you do it is that you start from this color band. Okay, so the red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, and magenta. So that way you just have all the pen weight and just assign to that. And all the other color is just extra. Okay, here are some of the line type convention we always used. Okay, solid projection, solid cut. People pretty much know how to do this. Once you go into the hin line, there's the differences. Okay, uh, if you show anything below, the line type has to be kind of close together. But if you do it like more of above, let's say if it's like a roof outline above, then you have to show more of a wider dash so you can tell the differences. Oops, there's center line, dash dot, and etc. And break line, I don't have to explain this. Most people probably seen a lot of this. Okay, just the differences because sometimes people put in hidden line below as like really thick, like really like white out separation. Okay, so convention always say that the below will always have this really squished hidden line, whereas above always has this wider hidden line above. Text size. Majority of people always ask, like, okay, how would you measure text size? So how you measure it is you actually print out a drawing, and what you do is you take a ruler and just measure the actual text size. So that's how we do it conventionally. So this is kind of like if you're doing it imperial metric, this is the size, okay? So for us, if you're using imperial, you kind of have to stick with this conventional 3/32, 1/8, 3/16, and quarter inch. During the AutoCAD days, what we have to do is we have to use this chart. We have to factor in. So if let's say your text size is 3/32, you multiply by this the scale factor, it gives you this 36 inch. Nowadays, you don't have to do that anymore because Revit is automatic. So you just put it in. In AutoCAD, you have the annotative scale. So if you say annotative, it will automatically scale according to the scale that you're using. So this is not a big problem anymore. In the old days, if you are doing like AutoCAD drawings, you kind of have to memorize the chart. But these days, you don't have to do it anymore. So thank goodness for the advancement in technology. So this is not really a factor. But I just want to show you, just in case in the future, if you do run into problems with drawings that have no scale, nothing, then you use this kind of a scale chart. Okay, so this is the millimeter, okay? So majority of the time what we do is that we use 2 millimeter, 2.5, 3, 3.5, and 6. You can use, there's a range. I always say like the smallest one you can use is 1.5, and then the biggest one you can go is like 7 to 9 millimeter. You do the same thing. So you take that size of the text and you multiply by the factor and you get that size. But in the new days, you don't have to worry about too much. But just keep in mind, this is where you kind of have to know what's the size that we should be using. It's always fall under 2 to 6, okay? For the imperial, it's always 3/32 to a quarter inch, okay? So those are the general size that you want to use. You do not want to go bigger, or else when you print it out, it's going to be too huge. Okay? Now, why do text always in caps? Okay, reason why is that if you are doing up and down, okay, and when you reverse it, you notice that the up becomes a down. Okay, so this is why we always force everybody to use capital letter, so you don't get into this mistake. But sometimes contractor will think this is down, okay, when it is up. So I've seen some drawings where people use sentence case. Just keep in mind, there's a reason why we use cap because of this mistake. Okay, if someone read this stair wrong, then that's going to be a big problem. You're going to get into more of litigations. So just keep in mind why text, everything has to be in cap. Okay, here's the reason why. As well, if you are like doing like line weights, if you're not doing the proper line weights, this is the problem you're going to get because on site, what ended up happening is that contractors going to just photocopy all the information. And what ended up happening is that you notice all this drawing is going to get harder and harder to read. Yeah, there's a reason why we want to make it as bold as possible. If you make your line too light and too, let's say, a grayscale, what ended up happening is that those guys are going to have problems reading some of your drawings. So here's just one of the example. I take a snapshot out of the old drawings. This is the problem with photocopies. is that you are going to lose information. So just be aware of that. Sheet size. I know a lot of people always ask, like, what's the sheet size? What should we use, and what should be, what kind of format you should be using. I always start when you plan out a sheet, regardless of what project, it has to fall within a large format and small format. Okay, so you can use this in between sizes, like a C size. Half of it is basically arch E. So what I typically do is that when you start out any drawing, always start out with anything that could be printed to a small format printer. So for instance, the small format, here what you have is that you have a tabloid, which is 11 by 17. And if you double the size, it's basically NCD, which is this size right here, 22 by 34. So when you start out any, let's say, small, big project, start out with the NCD, because half the size is going to be 11 by 17. You could go one size up, which is like arch D, okay, which is 24 by 36. The problem is that when you half size it, it's going to not fit, so you have to do scale to fit. So that's how I kind of plan out. Basically, start with this size first. That way you can go half size. But if you have to go anything bigger, you can stuck with the arch D. For working drawings, we have to go to the big size. So you will see NCE, NC arch E, AO, or F, which is known as arch E. There's like different sizes, but just keep in mind this is used for more of working drawings. However, if you're working with different jurisdiction, let's say for example, if you're working with Surrey, they have a very specific scale you have to put into your drawing. So what ended up happening is that if let's say your project is 1 to 100, they mandate that all drawing has to be 1 to 100 for plans. What ended up happening is that your drawing size would have to be within the large format, which is arch E and NCE, or sometimes you have to go AO. Just keep in mind, because different jurisdiction has a different requirement. Okay, for City of Vancouver, they don't care what scale size you're using. So what we typically do is that we start with like arch D. For Surrey, they're very adamant to use all metric. Okay, it's all metric, and then sometimes what ends up happening is that your size is going to be arch E or within this size. So here are basically kind of like what you use during different phases. So what I did here is I just put an X. Okay. So in the beginning of the phase, when you're doing conceptual design, you pretty much have to stick with, let's say, the NC size, which is like 11 by 17 or NCD. Sometimes we use this. We rarely use large size for conceptual design. But design development, what we are seeing in different jurisdictions, sometimes right now we're seeing it. I should put an X. I should update this list. I forgot to do that. So in here, yeah, this is basically the same from the conceptual design. But once you get into the construction documentation, what ended up happening is that you have to kind of go with the largest size just to fit all your details. So here I just mentioned about this. When you do conceptual design, I stick it with arch D or NCD. Okay, that way it just fits. It makes it a little bit easier. Yeah, that's pretty much the gist of the sheet size. Now, sometimes what ends up happening, I'm just going to go back. Sometimes you will have an issue with, let's say, if you're doing a transit line where the drawing has to be a custom large size. What will you use? So what ended up happening with this is that you kind of have to keep it the roll size. So the maximum width of the roll is 36 inches. For length, you can go as long as you want. You can go like 72 inches, which is like 5 feet. Okay, so just keep in mind you're restrained to 36 inches as your maximum. Just keep in mind, because sometimes you're going to do this a transit line where it stretches for miles, and you have to fit those into a drawing. So what you do is that you have to create a custom size. The width have to be 36 inch. All right, when you're doing a construction documentation, size would probably start from 1 to 100 or 1/8. Okay, that's the standard. The reason why we do that is it's easier for everybody. It's more to do with convention. Okay, in the old days, when you do like a paper drawings, we always start with 1 to 100 because that's the easiest. Maximum page size, you can just read through it. I'm not gonna go over too much. All right, drawing conventions. So there are like a couple of drawing conventions. If you're doing like, let's say, different sizes, what do you use? So for here, it says that site plan anything bigger than 1/32. Everything here, it's all site plan. Sometimes you will have site plan for 1/16. Okay, but these are basically all very typical stuff. So if you're doing within this, now you will get weird scales. Sometimes what end up happening is that if you want to do in between scale, let's say a 1/4 inch and 1/8, and here you're going to have 3/16, which is 1 to 75. It does happen, but I would caution people not to use weird scale because some plan checkers, they use the conventional scale, so they have to go in there and mark up all that stuff. Just be aware of that. You will see it. Some city will accept it, some won't. So you kind of have to make sure you stick it within this range. 100, 150, it's probably the most common one. So I would just stick it to that. Now, when you align a building, okay, let's say this is the actual Google map. Okay, what we typically do is that we take a building and we rotate the building horizontal or basically fit it within a page. Okay, you should never start your building off angle, or else it'll make it very, very difficult to dimension. In Revit, it becomes a trouble. It becomes a nightmare to kind of do dimensioning because what ends up happening is that when you do it off angle, if the users are not careful, you cannot dimension to walls. I've seen people done this, and it just drives them nuts. So just be aware, if you have to do a drawing that's off angle like this, make sure that when you start up a project, always rotate it so that the building is parallel to the sheet. And what you do here is that if this is your true north, what you do here is that you just add it in, okay, this is the project north, and this is the true north. All right, so in here, always align the detail the same with the plan. So let's say, assuming that you're doing any floor plan and details, I always recommend user is that if the floor plan is oriented this way, your details or your enlarged plan should orient it the same way. Don't like flip flop, because when user just have to flip pages, the minute that they see a drawing that's that's rotated 90 degree, it will throw them off completely. So just be aware of that. Okay, convention is basically stick it to one orientation as much as possible. If it doesn't fit, then you have to kind of justify why you're doing it and tell, like, let's say contractors or building officials so that they understand the requirement. If it's all for, let's say, eco-friendly, let's say you want to save paper, that is acceptable, but just warn them ahead of time. Sometimes you will see overlapping grid line bubbles. We've seen it in several projects. So what we typically do in this kind of a case is that we do staggering grids. So let's say, for example, you have a grid in between grids. So what we do is that we kind of do a staggered. And sometimes what we do is that we do this offset in between like that. Now, for any grids, what we typically don't use is O and I. Okay, that's a bad thing, because what happened is that it's very similar to 0 and 1. So just keep in mind, when you're doing a grid, you have to skip O and L. Okay, just skip it, just move on to the next one. That's just a drawing convention, because I've seen cases where people get confused between these two. Okay, and use left to right and bottom to top for sequencing. So if you're doing a grid, You go 1, 2, 3 from here, and then A going up. Okay. Sometimes I do see A going down. I mean, it really depends on where you started. If let's say your property line starts this corner, okay, it always depends on where your starting point is supposed to be. Most cases is usually on top or this bottom. So it kind of makes sense why it goes from here to here, because this is where your origin point is supposed to be. All right, property line. So what I typically do is that if you're doing any building, you always have to create some sort of a key plan to show contractor where you're going to start from your building. So here, what it is doing is that it's basically dimensioning it to the corner of the property line. So I always say start with any corner. Let's say one of these 4 corners and dimension it. So that way, when you start a grid, this is where your starting point of the building. So I always do this in any construction drawings if you're building a new building. That way you just tell contractor the starting point. So what they do is that they use an equipment and go to property line, and then they just measure off from the property line. So that's how they start. Just be aware. I always do this because it's more to do with trying to tell them exactly where the building sits in relation to your property line. Now, when you have an arc, let's assume that you have like a rows of column, they're like an arc. What I typically do here is that you do a center point of those arc. And what ends up happening is that you have to tie it to a building line. Let's assume that this corner is fixed. Then what you do is that you do a radius, right? Saying like how long this distance. You do a radius here, and then that center point you tie it to a building or tie it to a grid line. Okay, this is how you construct it, because arc, it can be very, very tricky to do it. Sometimes I'm seeing like all this really fancy facade where they're all curving, but somehow they have to tie it to something. So this is how they do it usually, is that first they know where the center point, and then they basically tie it to a building or a grid line. Too often what I see is that people do this, okay? This is what we should be doing, is that we should always keep the information relatively close to the detail. And you should not have an overlap on the right, where it tells you that don't do this, because this looks like the information is disjointed or it's different. And here we should avoid crossing each other, okay? If you have a text, let's say this one is referencing to this, then I would always recommend user just do a straight line and don't do like this curve. I know sometimes people get lazy. They would like to cross it together, but make sure that all that information gets translated well, because when you print it and it's having so much information, what ends up happening is that sometimes this information gets mistranslated. It will happen on site, so just be aware of it. Now, when you do a drawing that's basically a wall section, what we typically like to show, it's not basically show me the bottom, let's say this sill to the upper sill. What we want to show is that we want to show the progression of your wall section. So here, the detail, we see it floor to the sill, and then the top of the sill to the floor, underside of the floor. That way, the contractor will see this and say, okay, how is this going to tie in or have relation with this? If you show it this means that this is a clear story. That's what it represents. So if you have like a floor in between, right, just show it properly. So this one, just telling the contractor, oh, there's missing information from the floor. Okay, just avoid that. If you have like a massive drawing, what we typically do is that we break it up into pieces. So you could put in match line. I hardly use match line because they're more of a distraction. And then the other thing is that it appears like if you're using Revit, what ends up happening is that this appears everywhere. So what I typically do, rather than doing this, I would recommend putting in key plans so that you know exactly where you are. Right now, I do a lot of key plan for section, because sometimes you're going to have like multiple, like hundreds of sections that gets overlapped. So what we want to do is that just to show people where this section is at in relation to your key plan. Okay, always do it because it's a very useful kind of a tool. In probably my future session, I'll probably explain how do you create a key plan. It's not using detail lines, it's actually using real Revit objects. All right, one thing I always tell user not to do, in the AutoCAD days, you can customize your detail like this text. When you go into Revit, there's no way you can do this. Okay, Revit kind of streamline everything, so this makes it easier for us. But during the AutoCAD days, what we do is that this tick and this tick, you can actually customize it to do whatever you want, and that creates a lot of problems. So what this does is that it's telling you, never do this. Okay, don't do this customized version of ticks. Always keep it one standardization. If you don't do this, it'll confuse people. So this is why we keep it all consistent. All right. So when you're doing anything, let's say a building, you want to dimension the overall building. What we typically do is that when you dimension it, always put it on the outside. Okay. So what this shows us is that the overall dimension should always go on top, and whatever is intermediate should be below it. When you do the interior, it's the same way. So what you do is that you show the grid line based on the center point of this column. And then what you do is that you just dimension it, and dimension it reference to the outside of the building. Excuse me. You notice that here, interior, it always say, reference to outside of building or a grid line. I always like to use grid line because grid lines, it's always works. But this one, it just shows to the exterior of the building. All right, so here it's just showing you like cases where, let's say if you don't have a grid line, what you do is that you basically do the maximum, let's say this thing and this thing, overall dimensions. If you have a grid line, you always dimension to the grid line. When you do windows, okay, what it does is that it always goes to the either grid line or the edge of the building. Okay. And here it's just a convention. Okay, for if you have like a level, you do floor to floor height. But if you want to do this one, I don't typically see done a lot because this is not very useful. Height of the building element. Yeah, this one I would say if you have to do a wall section, this you can still do this, but I don't see it a lot in the newer like convention drawings. The reason why is that your windows is going to change height. Okay, and what ended up happening is that it's kind of pointless to do this. So I rather have the window schedule to tell me what's the height, but on the elevation, you can say, how high is this relative to the sill? That's pretty much what I would do. So here it's just another convention. If you're doing like a steel building or any other building, you always dimension it to the center. Okay. Reinforced concrete, yeah, it basically shows you, okay, steel frame, this is how we do it, and reinforced concrete, yeah, same idea. Okay, this can get a lot of controversy for a lot of user. Here, when you do dimensioning to the face of stud and concrete and masonry wall dimension, okay, this can be very confusing. So what it's showing us in here is that sometimes your building, what you have is that you have concrete masonry, and what you have is that you have like finishes on top of that. So what ended up happening with this is that it basically dimensioned to the face of stud, of concrete and masonry, to the wall dimensions. I've seen this done in other projects as well, but it's just be careful. Contractor love this because what it does is that it tells them where you start from the stud line. Okay, but just be aware, this could get really, really tricky. So what I typically like to do with this is that I like to do center line. Okay. Center line does help because it just basically say, okay, this is center line of the wall, and let contractors say, okay, within this center line, you just align all your studs there. I usually use this. Sometimes what we do with the clearance, like here, is we show, let's say the city wants you to kind of say what's the minimum clearances. So when you're doing a drawing for a city, they usually look after this, clearances, because they want to analyze the code. For us, we usually do centerline, but contractors sometimes will request that you do centerline or face a stud, concrete, masonry, and wall dimensions. Okay? Sometimes this is a special request. I do see it sometimes, but it just talk to your contractors and see what they want, because it will save you time before you go and do your dimensioning. When you do like a section or like a tower, we always do one string of dimensions showing every floor to floor height. Okay, this is a must. That way you know exactly how tall you're building. All right, accuracy can be a very, very, like, it's a big issue in AutoCAD and Revit. So my recommendation is that if let's assume that you have a setback that measures 5.5. I actually recommend that you actually do it 5.5, because I've seen a point where people just do 5.5, like it just basically do this. And what ended up happening is that all their building is not lined up. It's always have this really weird dimensioning. Revit can get very picky, and sometimes the wall would not join properly. So I would just say round it up to the nearest. Let's say if it's a 1/2 inch, just round it up to 1/2 inch. You just keep Revit happy. If you do this a lot of the time, Revit would just fail. I don't know why. It's probably the programming itself. Okay, Revit wants to be a whole number. It doesn't like to have this fraction number that's really weird. And same with angles as well. Just keep it happy. Now, there's one glitches that Revit does is that if you have a 45-degree, and sometimes what happens is that Revit would tell you, oh, this is not aligned, even though it's 45-degree. Just keep in mind, Revit will do that. It could be a glitch. So what I typically tell users that if it's like a 168, keep it 168. Don't have this really weird angle round off. Okay, especially when you're doing a building. That way, it makes it a lot easier when you do dimensioning. The reason why is that if you do a weird dimensioning, it just makes things really hard for the rest. I've seen parts where I have to do a lot of aligning. Let's say this wall, even though it's 168, and then when you do joint geometry with the floor below, it does this weird banding, and sometimes it just doesn't want to fit. Okay, just be aware of that. All right, so here's an example of what we typically do when you do like working drawings. So what we have is that we always call one is the overall plan, where we show the entire floor, how it ties into adjacent site landscape, and also indicates setback and right of way. And once you get into the 1 to 50, let's say a 1/4 inch, we call it partial. I know that sometimes people likes to label in like 1/4 inch, 150 plan, etc., etc. That is, you can do that. But I like this convention overall and partial. The reason why is that you basically keep it not tied to a scale. Because sometimes this overall could be 316. Okay, I've seen it time and time, people put in scale. And what ended up happening is that it causes a lot of confusion because the scale is saying 1/8, but the drawing it says 316. So which one do you follow? So just try to keep it like not scale, just say overall and partial. So here just an example of a startup plan. Okay, so when you do a startup plan, what we do is that we just say label it, like how much this is, like off angle, etc. So this is kind of like an example how we usually do it. And you have a grid, and then a grid basically goes to center line and just tells you that this is the starting point. Okay, showing color. This is becoming very, very I would say a lot of contractors loves color. The reason why they loves color is because hatch sometimes can get very confusing, especially when you're doing black and white. You don't know what material they are supposed to be. So color plotting has become so cheap that you can actually do it. Like it's almost, I've talked to some of the vendors, some of them actually printing color for a cost that's like almost like a fraction of what you used to pay. Because in the past, what you do is that it costs like $6 square foot just to print a drawing. Now you can get it down as much as 20 cents or even less if you do a bulk printing. So they're high speed now. There's a lot of high speed color prints. So it's very, very cheap. So if you want to do an elevation just to show, let's say, material, rather than creating a legend for like different materials, that is acceptable. Okay. Now think of it as when you're doing a elevation, and you have to tell contractor what color those supposed to be. If you're doing black and white, chances are you're not going to know what they are. But if you do it in color, you notice that you can tell, oh, this is this color, this is this color. So it makes things a lot easier. Okay, like when you look at this panel itself, it makes a lot of sense that this one has to be printed in color. You cannot do it with the normal black and white. Because if you do it in black and white, it's not going to help you. Okay, you can mark it as saying that, oh, this is number 1, number 2, but you know what? If it's color, it makes them a lot easier to kind of know what panel is what. Imagine you have to do a color for, let's say, this is in school in Singapore. Imagine you have to do a color for school, and if you have black and white, chances are you can get mixed up with different colors. So if you do it like this with color elevation, then it makes perfect sense. The contractor will know what color they want to color with and just make it match. Because everybody is loves picture. Okay, if you give them a black and white like this, they're gonna it takes them time. Okay, the brain is gonna hardwire into translating your information. So if you give them color, yeah, they can just do it right away. I've seen a lot of 3D section becoming part of construction documentation. So here's an example what I've seen other projects have done. So what this does is that it basically helps contractor to kind of differentiate what's the material. Now, however, if you have to do this type of 3D drawings, it can be done, but it will take you a lot of time to kind of maintain it, because this drawing, it's only used for that project, and you cannot use it for other projects as well. This is the unfortunate thing. If you have to do 3D section, it is doable. It can be done, but you kind of have to make sure that all the materials and everything it's done correctly. So far, we haven't done this as much. Well, some projects we've seen it done, but we're starting to see more and more people using this, because this is a good way to kind of cut a section and let contractor knows what goes first, and that way it's much clearer for them. So here's a perfect example. I think this is done in SketchUp. So SketchUp is becoming another software that a lot of designer loves to use it, just to show like the materialities and all that stuff. However, to get to this 3D, you kind of have to know construction. So a lot of time, this is not in our radar at the moment until you know how construction and all the materials are put together. So this will be for another couple more years before everybody knows how to build 3D section. So this is the old days. Like I love Japanese drawing, because this is kind of illustrate perfectly where the future that we're heading towards. It's kind of like the 3D world where we're able to kind of cut a section and see the depth. Okay, and it shows you all the walls and everything, and shows what they are. So ultimately, what we will see is basically make your drawing more of an IKEA. So you basically have IKEA is a very, very the instruction. If you buy anything from IKEA, what it does is that there's no dimension, no nothing. All you do is that you just follow instruction. So in the future, I see our drawing and the process. It's more of an IKEA. So what you do is that you tell contractor how you're going to build your building. Okay, so this is how they do it, and et cetera, et cetera. We're not there yet because a lot of our buildings are very, very complicated. But if we have to push towards more of the IKEA version of shop drawings or construction drawings, yeah, I think it can be done. Well, here's another. This is a funny picture I've seen from an internet. Let's assume that you want to build a Stonehenge using IKEA methodology. So this is what you're going to tell contractor to do. First, you get this, you get that. You need 10,000 people, and you're going to have this part, and then you just tell them what to do and what not to do. So the idea is pretty similar to IKEA kind of a thing, I mean, for construction. So this is how you build Stonehenge. At the end, people get tired, and then you just kick the column. Any questions so far? Yeah, this is short and sweet. This is kind of like conceptual. Now, one thing I have to kind of go into. Oh, actually, let's see what this. Oh yeah. Okay, so here's a good kind of like hand drawing graphic standard. So this is a good website I actually went to just for like old drawings from the old days. So this is kind of like how they represent some of the plans. It's kind of neat to see how they're done. Okay, just simple information. This is kind of like the key plan, how you do it. Okay, but it kind of represents a lot of the buildings are put together. All right, any questions so far? Yeah, I have to cut out a lot of the stuff. I know that I cut out a lot of the stuff because they're not really kind of like standard. Okay, so for a lot of users, like if you don't understand standard, that's fine. I'm not gonna like for me, I'm not gonna be too how should I say it? It's more like I'm not gonna impose standards on people. But the thing is, I just want people to learn, okay? Because this is how you kind of progress, okay? Rather than impose standards on people and then people get frustrated. I don't want people to be like that because that's not how everybody should be frustrated. What we want is just look at solutions, like how do you tackle solution case by case. So this is kind of like how I approach a lot of the standard is that if there's a problem, how do you fix it immediately? But in the future, this is where we go back into planning. First, we plan it, execute it, and see if there's a problem. If there's a problem, we go back to planning. So this is kind of like the progression of how we should be evolving our standards. Now, earlier on, I had a question about, what should you be doing for, let's say, an area and the rooms if you want to do it. So here I'm just going to show like how I would approach it if you want to do, let's say, a unit plan. Okay. I'm just going to open up like an old project that I've done. So you kind of understand the how I would approach when you're building a building with the area. Okay, so here I'm just gonna open up a project. So what this project has is that it's similar to all the other like unit plans. So what you want to do is that if you are starting out as a plan, you want to basically create an area plan for your all the areas of your units. After that, if you want to do, let's say, an area of each individual room, this is where you're able to do it. So here I'm just going to open it up. just to show you kind of like the example. All right. So here is an example of a plan. So here, what I have is this is an area. Okay, this is an area object. So a lot of time, what you do is that when you're creating a unit plan, I always say create an area plan so that your area plan will have your units. Okay, this is basically giving me all the units and all that stuff. So what I have here is that this is just showing me what is the unit. I think this is what this will answer your question, because this is where I started for all the units. You can configure where you want the area to be. Because if you're using a room, right, room itself, if you click on this, room is very limited. Room itself will only do it wall finish, center, or core center. So you can't pick and choose. So it's either you have this or you don't have it. Whereas the area plan, what it does is that you can actually define the boundary where you want that area to be. In most cases, what they have is that they have it, wall at center, exterior, you basically put it there, and that's pretty much it, right? And what ends up happening is that you can pick and choose, customize it so fit that area. Now, the other thing you can do with the area plan is that you can actually create what's known as the key plan. You detect the boundary of that. And what you do is that you basically create a key plan based on the same thing. Let's see here, a key plan level 1. So all I did here is that I just took that. You notice that this is just a area boundary. Okay. You notice that it works pretty well, because if you are doing like a unit plan, let's say here is an example of a unit plan. All the areas are done pretty much. So what you have here is that you can just display your suite layout. Let's assume that you're doing the suite layout where you have to show every suite. And here, what you have is that you have a key plan, which allows you to go in and just mark where your unit's supposed to be. So it gives user, it's kind of like, it's a good way to put in a key plan just to mark where your unit's supposed to be so that you know exactly where they are supposed to be. This does help quite a bit. As well, sometimes what I do is that in section, you have what's known as the key plan for section. So that when you go, let's assume that this project is very complicated. So what it did here is that you notice that in this key plan, I'm just showing you exactly where those area, and then it basically tells you exactly where those are, as well as elevation. So here, what I did for my elevation is you are able to do the same. So what I did is that I just duplicate the key plan and just put in my area. Now, this one, it's just using a this object right here. So when you go to manage, well, not manage, sorry. It's using basically view reference. So if I click on here, so what I have is that it's just an elevation. Let's say elevation, sure. There we go. So it's basically just using a view reference. It's a very, very good I would say object to use, because I use key plan, and this is exactly how I approach a lot of this. If you have like a very complicated drawings and you need some sort of like a referencing marker, so key plan becomes a very good tool if you ever want to do like tell people which elevation this belongs to. Because right now it's like you know, if you have like a very complicated building and you have to mark exactly which this is supposed to be, then this becomes a very good indicator. All right. Any questions so far with this? No question. This is an actual plan. Okay, so this object, you notice that when I select this object, right? This is actually a wall, right? So what you do is that it's very easy to create a key plan. So what you have to do is just take a floor plan and just duplicate your key plan, right? Just duplicate it. Yes, they are view reference. So this view reference, you can create top and bottom, right? So it's basically it's a view reference. If anybody wants to use that, this is like exactly how I would approach it. We use section as well. Again, this is also view reference. So view reference, I like view reference because you can actually create your own version of it, right? So you're not using Revit section because Revit section sometimes you're not going to get the graphics that you wanted. So what I typically do is that I just use view reference, and you can just move this back and forth. Okay, so it's very quick and very dirty because what happened is that when you're doing a section, sometimes what ends up happening is that this section cuts right into the balcony. And in Revit, what I have is that I have a jog. So if you let's say if you want to see the plan itself, it has a jog. So sometimes what happened with the like this particular here, I'll just activate it. I know the jog can be a very problematic. You notice that I have a lot of jog. Okay, if I had to show that in Revit for for this section, you notice that's not going to show jog. So here you can just kind of like move it up and down. So it's kind of like a graphical, so that the user understand what they're supposed to be. And plus, what I like about it is that they can actually go to that view. So it's very good. Kind of like go back into that section. Okay, there we go. That's this section. So this is kind of like a marker for them to kind of go in there. All right. Yeah, hopefully that answers the question. Yeah, if you have any question for the future stuff, I'll probably do a lot more. I would say more of not more of a hands-on kind of a thing for Revit. Probably not hands-on, but more of a theory kind of a thing, like why we do certain things this way, how you make this into a color. If you want to do like this color section, this is actually done by using room. Okay, if you do a room, you can actually do a color elevation like this. So how do you match it with an area plan? That's the other thing I should talk about. So that when you cut a section, this particular object has to have the same color as your, not this one, but sheet, same color as here. Okay, I'll probably do one from the future, how to do it, because sometimes what ended up happening. So what ended up happening is that sometimes you want to match, right? So if you're doing this as a DP drawings and you want the color to match up with your section, right? How do you do it, kind of a thing. So, alrighty. So that concludes the whole presentation. Hopefully you kind of get enjoyment out of this. And yeah, please comment and yeah, just email me whenever you want. Thank you.